Hey everyone, today in our COM theory class, we are going to talk about just the tradition, a little bit of the background, what you can study in the field of communication. There are more in-depth discussions on each of these topics that we'll have throughout the semester. We might have them in other classes, but right now it's just sort of a general overview of what this field is all about and what it is you can study within the field. So communication is about studying human interactions, the ways in which humans communicate and then create the culture around them. I like to think of it as the ways in which narratives shape our culture, specifically from this sort of rhetorical tradition, which is where I find myself more within these seven contexts within communication. These seven contexts are what the textbook laid out. Depending on the scholar you talk to, they might add one or two, they might take away one or two, but these seven cover just about every sort of specialty you could get into if you pursue a master's or a PhD degree. For an undergraduate degree, what'll likely happen is you take about one class in each of these issues, and so you have a sort of a general broad knowledge of everything that's being covered within the field. So let's go through these and we'll learn a little bit more. All right. So the first is intrapersonal communication. Intra, T-R-A, as opposed to inter, T-E-R. Intra means within, so you can so communication with oneself. So there are fields that go around, or there are people within the field of communication who study things like self-esteem, things like loneliness, the ways in which people sort of narrative sense making of an individual's life. So, what are the stories that I tell myself in order to get through my day? If you've been through a traumatic experience, what stories do you tell yourself in order to navigate through that trauma? This all happens within sort of a subset of intrapersonal communication. There's interpersonal communication, so there's scholars who specialize in this, which is has to do mostly with relationship maintenance. So inter is between two people. You could do family communication would sort of fall. Family, if you're talking about one-on-one kind of stuff. Romantic relationship is a big one that goes here. Friendships. Then we can move into small groups. We're getting a little bit bigger. Family communication again could work here when you're talking about a group as far as what roles are everyone playing and how does that family maintain cohesiveness. Small group could also probably work on sports teams depending on how big the team is. If you're getting into large NFL organizations, you're probably going to look at organizational communication. But small group could work. A high school basketball team. It's small enough where everybody sort of falls into some sort of role as far as you have team captains, you have coaches. How do they all interact with each other? How do you decide who's a leader and who's not a leader? How do you decide who gets to make decisions for family vacation? Who has the ultimate say on where you and your friends go and eat lunch today? These are things that come up in small group communication as far as how the dynamics play out. Organizational communication looks at things like hierarchies and management. So when you do have a large organization, how do you disseminate information to them? There's this rhetorical tradition. This is where I mostly hang out as far as what I like to study specifically. So it does deal with public speaking, but also rhetoric, as we'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. It's a study of messages and their persuasiveness and how they are persuasive. So as people speak publicly or put messages sort of out into the world, those messages can change the culture around us. They could maintain and perpetuate the current existing culture. So this entire idea that sort of the stories around us shapes our reality is what I am mostly interested sort of within the field of communication. Mass media, obviously, it's going to include television, internet, books. One thing that's interesting here is that there is this barrier between sender and receiver, so you're usually sitting behind a screen. But these create these sort of larger cultural narratives, so this has a lot of influence with regard to what we see on TV, and then we are influenced by that. We have emotional attachments to what we see on TV. It changes the way in which we move through the world because we're sort of learning how we're supposed to be in the world based on the messages that are being sent to us. We learn language based on mass media, right? So again, sort of these larger cultural narratives that shape our reality. So this can get tied to some aspects of rhetorical tradition as well. And then finally, cultural or intercultural communication. So communication between two cultures. How do different cultures speak to one another, communicate with one another? How do they see each other? What sort of barriers are between our culture and another culture? Is it this sort of failure to communicate or understand the values and belief systems between the two groups of individuals? All right. So this is where you can kind of hang out if you pursue a degree in communication. And again, if you're an undergrad, you're going to study all of these different items to some extent. As you get into your master's, your PhD program, you're most likely going to specialize into sort of one or two. A little bit more elaboration on the rhetorical tradition. So I like to think of rhetoric as a study of messages and their persuasiveness. If you pick up any textbook on rhetoric, you're going to find a different definition in every book. This is sort of the amalgamated definition that I came up with a few years ago that I think works best. All right. So you are studying messages, and this could include public speaking, right? But it could also include news broadcasts. So some of the papers that I've written over the years, a lot of them have to do with news coverage of current events. So I get extremely interested in why is it that we all live in the same if you're an American watching this, why is it that we all live in the same country, but we have for the most part we have these very sort of binary divided ways of seeing the exact same news story. So for instance, if you watch Fox News and I watch MSNBC, we both move through the world thinking that we're correct, and we both see the same. Most of us are going to be aware of the same story, but we have very different interpretations of what that story is because we've consumed competing narratives about what that story means. And so that's where I get interested as far as how different large narratives become persuasive. And then all of a sudden, again, we go back to this idea of we live in this world of stories. Well, I move through the world. If I think I said I'll be an MSNBC viewer for this example. If I move through the world with that narrative, I'm going to look at the world very differently than somebody who's moving through the world watching Fox News, even if me and that other person are neighbors. And so that is fascinating to me, that we have such very different opinions about the immediate world around us based on just the stories that we consume. Rhetoric, it's functional as well as artful. So most public speaking books will have something about the effect of like the art of public speaking. So what this means is that the function is it has to have a scaffold that you can sort of build your argument upon. But the artfulness has to do with the idea of, the charisma behind it. Do you have good tone and inflection and emotion, and are you pulling the audience in? So a good question I ask my students is, do the best ideas always persuade? And the answer is no. So if you take two political candidates, a lot of research shows is that the candidate who is most charismatic is going to win the election. You could have a very intelligent, sort of wonky, digs into public policy candidate, and if they are super boring, they are not going to get elected to the presidency. One of the most asinine questions that I know are on public polling, that's in public polling for the president, that has nothing to do with the presidency, but it's a very good indicator as to who's going to win the presidency, is there's this question of which candidate would you like to have a beer with? And again, that speaks to sort of artfulness, charisma. And if you kind of go back to just, some of the last few individuals who've been elected to the presidency, if you get away from, whether or not you like their policies or not, and you just sort of look at like energy and charisma and ability to engage and connect emotionally with people, those are the candidates that win. All right. So that's another part of rhetoric beyond just the function of making a good argument. You also have to be charismatic and engaging. There's a semiotics tradition, which is the study of signs. Speech act theory plays into this a little bit. Like how do words sort of make us act? So if we think about a wedding, we can think about it along two different lines. one, you put a ring on somebody's finger and all of a sudden it makes us feel different. It's a sign that allows us to move through the world differently. All right, so a ring on a finger communicates something to yourself, as well as the rest of the world with regard to your marital status in life. Speech act theory also gets into sort of saying words, sort of manifest things. So again, at a wedding, if I say I do at the altar, all of a sudden, speech act theory is going to, the idea behind it is that it sort of makes it a reality, right? This love and this connection and this sort of family situation you put yourself in. So saying I do actually changes the way in which the relationship, the way in which you inhabit that relationship. So a couple more traditions that are looked at in communication. Let's get to a few more here. Phenomenology is the study of lived experience. And what phenomenologists try to do is they try to take things that are mostly considered subjective. So your experiences, your emotions, your consciousness, right? Things that you can only know about, and they try to put them into an objective model that we could actually study, right? And try to figure out. So they study lived experiences. You have this sort of internal and external reaction to the world, right? And both the way in which you physically move through the world as well as the way in which you comprehend the world, that shapes your reality. So again, we can both move through the same neighborhood. We can go through the same school. We can go to shopping at the same establishments around our house. But our internal experiences might be very different, and all of a sudden we both objectively see the world in very different ways. So this is what phenomenologists are trying to get to. They're trying to study people's lived experiences, consciousness. How do people sort of interact with the world in these very subjective ways? They're trying to make them objective to try to better understand how people move through the world. All right, cybernetics, which I think is extremely important, even more important than just a year ago, 5 years ago. Cybernetics, it studies all the noise in the communication process. And we're not talking physical noise necessarily. We're talking about all these little interruptions that happen constantly. So we do have messages that we're trying to get out to the world, but there are unpredictable outside influences and interruptions, right? So you're text messaging a person, and all of a sudden you're getting all these notifications on your screen. Or you're sitting down to watch a movie, and you can't get through 2 hours of a movie because you're getting all these notifications on your screen. Or you're sitting in the classroom and you have the inability to watch 30 minutes of a YouTube lecture with your professor because you're getting all these notifications on your screen. That's what cybernetics is looking at, is how do all these little interruptions throughout the day, how do they actually affect the way in which we are consuming sort of larger, more traditional material. There are some really interesting studies and research that's coming out now. You're welcome to look it up. But it looks at the ways in which, attention span for things like full-length movies, let's say a 2-hour-long movie, the inability of a lot of people to sit down and read a 300-page book in a relatively, at a relatively moderate, normal pace. How all of that is, people don't have the same ability that they did, 10, 20 years ago to do those things, because if I'm constantly on this thing, right, this phone, and I'm constantly getting notifications, or most of my world revolves around, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and whatever else is going on out there, like TikTok or Snapchat and all these other social media things. These are all very quick modes of communication, and they start to rewire is a terrible analogy. The idea of like your brain is wired, but go with me here. But they start to sort of rewire your brain to appreciate and to only think in sort of short attention span ways. So when you finally get away from your phone and you sit down to watch a 2-hour-long movie, you find that every 30 minutes it's like, I gotta take a break. Like, I can't finish this movie right now. I'll watch it later. You sit down to sit down to read a book, and 5 pages in, you're like, ugh, the equivalent of reading 5 pages is like the equivalent of reading like 100 tweets. And you're like, I'm only used to reading like 1 or 2 tweets at a time here, and now all of a sudden you're asking me to read the same amount of material as like hundreds of tweets. Well, your brain, right, all of a sudden is thinking about short attention span as opposed to longer attention span. This is why, on YouTube, I think the videos with the most views or whatever on YouTube, um, are somewhere around, like, the ideal time for a YouTube video is like less than 5 minutes. Um, so, obviously this is of interest. So I'm not going to say it's a problem, but I'm going to say it's of interest with regard to cybernetics. Um, a person who studies this, who thinks she would probably think it's a problem. I don't want to put words in her mouth because she's far more intelligent on this than I am. But Sherry Turkle, who works at MIT, well, she did work at MIT. I don't know where she's at now. But she's written a couple books. One of the books, her first, or probably maybe the most famous one, was called Alone Together. It came out, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. And then shortly after that, she came out with another book called Reclaiming Conversation. And in both of these books, she taught, and again, she's at MIT, so Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So this is the place that's is responsible for a lot of these cool things, these cool little gadgets we have. And what she studies is the psychology of, maybe, we should just be thinking about how these little devices we have are changing our relationships. And again, it's not good or bad. It's not, take all your technology and throw it out the window. It's just a question of, look, if you're going to use this stuff, you should just be conscious of the fact, you should just recognize, you should reflect on it a little bit that, like, this is probably going to change the dynamics of your face-to-face communication. It's going to change the way you read a book, or the way you could read a book. It's going to change the way you watch movies because of attention span. It's going to change the conversations you have at dinner with your family or your loved ones, right? If everybody's on their phone at dinner, she looks at, she's like, that's just, you have to recognize it's going to change something. So in these stories, right, and this is 15 years ago when she's telling these stories, so it wasn't as prevalent than it is now. But this is when we first started, like, seeing these stories pop up in mainstream culture, where a researcher would say, like, I went out to dinner at, I don't know, like Applebee's, and I sat down, and the table next to me there was this family of four, and I noticed that they were all on their phone, and then the waitress came, they ordered, they were still on their phone, then they were all on their phone while they ate dinner, and then as they paid the bill, they were still on their phone, and they never looked up and talked to each other. Like, all of them individually were on their phone their entire time. What Turkle is just sort of helping us to recognize, or trying to get us to recognize, is that has to change family dynamics, right? It has to change family communication. So again, it's not a judgment of whether or not it's good or bad. It's probably changing the way in which our society works. We should be aware of it. So she studies it, and she's encouraging other people to study it, just to figure out how all these little interruptions change the dynamics in our interactions. All right. Socio-psychological. So obviously, psychological is happening in your head, cultural is happening around you. But psychological is looking at the tension between collective and individual responsibility. Now, there are a lot of there's this sort of political divide that's happened between, is it a collective issue? Is it an individual responsibility issue? Should you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or does the culture around you have a responsibility to help you because they've marginalized you in some way? The answer is it's complicated, and it's both. Like, all problems are both cultural and individual. Um, but we do get into interesting questions with regard to how much choice do we actually have in the world, and we'll get down to free will versus determinism briefly over here. If you want to know more, take a philosophy class. But one thing that communication studies can look at is sort of how much choice do we actually have with regard to how we move through the world based on the messages that are available to us. So the text of the world, the conversations of the world, the messages of the world are influencing us, and we are acting accordingly, whether or not we are conscious of it or not. So I hear certain talking points from my favorite politician or news commentator, and then I go around and I think I have this brilliant argument about tax policy, or immigration, or gun control. But if we really start digging into it, it's like, well, the only reason I think I know that is because I watched a 5-minute segment on my preferred news channel, right? Most of us are not experts in any of these political topics. Most of us have not read, mounds of research on these sorts of topics. Most of us are not personally affected very much by some of these topics. But we move through the world as if we're all experts because we consumed a 5-minute segment on our preferred news channel, and all of a sudden we're reposting it on Twitter and Facebook and everything else, and we're acting like people who disagree with us are idiots, when really all they did is they consumed a 5-minute communication worth of material on the opposite partisan news channel. All right, so we can get into this question of like how much choice do we actually have in the world with regard to how we move through the world, right? An example of this, as far as like a very basic deterministic thought experiment, is this idea is like you didn't even choose to be born. So if you didn't choose to be born, why are you so bold to think that you're choosing all these steps along the way? Your behavior is definitely influenced by outside forces, whether or not you want to admit it or not. A real quick, fun little way to think about this is if you're in church or if you're in front of grandma, whether or not you use profanity. So you might not consciously choose to use profanity or not use profanity sort of as a communication strategy in your everyday life, but you do either consciously or unconsciously recognize that there's a time, place, and appropriateness with regard to using profanity. So you're most likely not going to swear in church. Now, you probably don't walk into church and say, okay, I'm not going to swear here. But while you're in church, you somehow, one way or another, make it through, an hour and a half service without swearing. If you are in front of your grandma, if you're in front of little kids, you make it through without using profanity. When you're with your friends on a Saturday night, you're probably using profanity, right? So there's ways in which we change up our communication strategies as far as the vocabulary that we use, the stories that we tell, whether or not they're inappropriate or appropriate types of stories and jokes. And most of the time we don't make conscious decisions about this. We just sort of like fall into these communication patterns. And again, it's just sort of when you walk into a new context, the way in which you're supposed to behave in that context changes, right? So that context is determining the ways in which you communicate, right? Determinism looks at, on a long enough timeline, we can trace everything back to a first cause. So if there's a cause and effect, well, it's like, I got here because something happened that affected me to get here. And it's like, okay, what caused me to be, in this room, in this house, at this job? Okay, well, I gotta, what was the original cause? Okay, then I went to school, and what made me go to school, and right? So you kind of keep tracing it back to this first cause. Now, here's a big thing that I like to. There's always going to be a debate on free will versus determinism, and this is what I tell people if they get a little bit too heady about it. Is look, we can have a debate on whether or not whether or not I have free will or whether or not everything is deterministic. What I tell people is like, look, even if you don't believe in free will, even if you believe that there's some sort of like deterministic plan laid out for you, you should always act as if you have free will. You should act as if you have free will because it gives you some sense of agency, right? We can get into the philosophical questions as to whether or not free will or determinism exist, but you should walk through the world as if you have free will. I think you become more conscious of your choices and you become more intentional with your choices. And it makes it harder for you to give yourself an excuse to kind of back out of your choices and say, well, like I'm just kind of a product of this system around me, as opposed to like I'm going to make choices that can empower me and give me agency. I can do a whole other video about free will and determinism another time. All right, sociocultural, we act based on scripts. So how do you know how to act with a teacher on the first day? How do you know if you become a parent one day? It's like, how do you know how to raise a kid? Sociocultural is just this recognition that humans are advanced primates and we are mimicking people around us to whom we aspire to be, right? So you've never had a kid before. How do you know how to be a parent? Well, the kid comes home and you're like, okay, what do my parents do? What would my parents do? I have a friend who has a kid. What did they do for the first couple months with that kid? If you're a student at a university and you're a freshman student, it's your first semester, you walk into the classroom, you're like, I don't know what to do because I've never been a college student before. You look around at the other college students in the room. You're like, okay, how are they sitting? What are they doing? What do they have out? Right? You know how to be a student based on looking at other students who have been through this. For those of you who are teachers, right, or college professors, right? I've been a college professor for 15 years or so. I didn't know how to be a professor on the first day, but as I was preparing for my classes, my first thought was, let me think about the college professors that I really liked and how do they conduct classes, and I'm going to try to mimic that type of behavior. All right. So social culture is we're learning how to be who we are, whether it's, being a good sibling, whether or not it's being a good parent, whether or not it's being a coach or a teacher or whatever job you have. You learn based on scripts, and you learn what those scripts are based on consumed communication. So it could be direct people, or it could be, I learned how to be this type of person because I watched a lot of TV shows that had that type of person in it, right? Little kids look up to professional athletes. So when an athlete's on TV and they say, eat your Wheaties and work out and go to bed and don't do drugs, little kids start to follow those scripts if they're trying to be, these great athletes like they're heroes that they see, on TV. All right. So that's what social culture is about. We consume communication. That communication shapes the way we act because the communication is coming from people that we're hoping to emulate. All right, and it looks like the last slide here. Communication also has what's called a critical tradition or the critical turn. It's heavily influenced by Karl Marx. I do an entire discussion on Karl Marx and yeah, sort of critical theory stuff in a different class. But for you all in this class, the one thing you need to know is that the critical tradition is all about sort of, it looks at systems of power, right? So it moves through the world and says, every way in which interaction happens is based on power. Now, Karl Marx was interested in how power operates as far as class. So there's a class system. So there's people in the lower class, proletariats, people in the upper class, the bourgeoisie, right? And Karl Marx was all about like, how can we make this society more egalitarian where everybody's equal as opposed to this huge class divide, right? So it's all about power, right? A little bit of a problem with this is if you think about everything in terms of power, if you look at the world around you and say it's all about power, then the only thing that I can do is try to get more power for myself, which means less power for somebody else, right? And so now it's become this power struggle. And I personally think that the world is made up of a lot of systems that don't have anything to do with power. Like there's lots of ways in which you act that, don't have anything to do with power or trying to gain more power. But either way, the critical tradition looks at power. Now, there are what are called neo-Marxist theories. So they still look at how power manifests, but they don't do it strictly through looking at class systems. So there's things like critical race theory, which you might have heard a lot about on the news lately, that look at, it's a neo-Marxist theory because it looks at race as that there are these power dynamics, that there are these hierarchies that create race divisions, but it uses Marxist tenets to talk about power systems specifically related to race. Feminism is a neo-Marxist theory, so it looks at power dynamics specifically with regard to sex and gender. There's lots of other disability studies is something that's up and coming, queer theory, right? So they're all interested in how do communication strategies of the world, how do they create hierarchies and power systems that normalize some behaviors or some individuals and oppress other individuals, right? But at the end of the day, it's all circumventing this idea of power and hierarchies, and there are some people at the top and there are some people at the bottom, and how can we sort of rearrange the system to make things more equal, and they're all coming from communication strategies. All right. So Nietzsche fits in here a little bit. This is Nietzsche here with the mustache. This is not Karl Marx. This is Nietzsche. One thing that becomes of interest in this critical turn is they start to eliminate this idea of objective truth. So no longer, but now all of a sudden we have this sort of idea of like subjective truth, and we'll get into this more in a different class period. But what we have here as far as this critical turn is like everybody kind of gets to define their own truth, right? So when you hear these celebrities on TV saying things like, this is my truth, right? I'm going to speak my truth. I want you to speak your truth. The problem with that is if everybody has their own truth, then everything is completely subjective, and there's nothing that we can all, as researchers, there's no ultimate capital T objective truth that we're all striving for. The common tradition in academia is we're all trying to figure out what is the objective reality of, the world around us, right? We're all striving for this capital T truth. When the critical theorists come in and say, well, everybody just has their own version of truth and there is no objective truth, the problem with that is everybody gets to judge the world based on their own standards and criteria, and then all of a sudden there's no agreed upon understanding of how the world actually works. So this becomes a problem for lots of reasons that we can get into later. But the start of some of this was relayed by Nietzsche. He wasn't around for sort of the 20th century postmodern critical turn in the social sciences, but he was sort of seeing the rumblings of what it was going to look like. And so Nietzsche has this quote where he says, "God is dead," right? And what he's saying here is sort of this objective reality, this search for capital T truth. He's like, that is dead, right? So you don't have to just say like God if you're not a religious person. Nietzsche was an atheist, right? What he's saying is like we've killed this idea of one objective capital T truth that we're all striving for. He's like, that's dead, right? The finality of this quote that a lot of people miss is they say, and Nietzsche says, and we killed him. So not only is God dead, right? But Nietzsche, he's not celebrating the fact that God is dead. He's saying like this idea of ultimate truth where we can all live in this objective world and strive for objectivity. It's like that idea is dead and we all killed that idea. And then Nietzsche gets worried where he says, okay, well, if we don't have this sort of objective truth that we're all striving for and we all kind of get to go our own ways and sort of create our own realities, I get to have my truth, you get to have your truth. Nietzsche says, well, God or the idea of truth sort of cohesively holds a community together. And if we're not all striving for that, it can fray the community. If I have a different idea of what objective reality is than you, it starts to create divisions within the community, right? And then he gets into, if we kill God, what happens? Now there's this vacuum, right? If we all live under this idea that there is this sort of objective truth, there's this objective way that the world works, but we kill that off and we say the world can work any way that I want to based on my own lived experience. Nietzsche says, well, now suddenly we have a void. And within that void, what's going to happen is, essentially like strong men are going to fill that void and they're going to call themselves God. So people talked about this in regard to like the bloody 20th century, right? So you have people like Lenin and Stalin are like, oh, like we killed off this idea of God. We have we know what is best for people now. We're going to fill that void. And if you have, tyrannical people fill that void and sort of claim to have ultimate power and ultimate knowledge, those people can become extremely tyrannical. We saw this at the Cultural Revolution in China. We saw this with Pol Pot down in Cambodia, right? Anytime you sort of eliminate the idea of there is this objective reality with regard to how the world works, and you kill off that idea, if my reality gets to be true and your reality gets to be true, now all of a sudden all we do is we just compete for whose reality gets to shape the world. And if I'm a stronger guy and I got more of an army behind me, guess what? We're going to fight to the death. And all of a sudden, I get to implement my plans for society. All right. So the critical tradition in Com is looking at ideas of power, and whoever gets to tell the best story, they're the ones who have access to power. So it's all about storytelling as opposed to looking at the objective reality of how the world works, because the critical tradition is more based on a person's subjective experience as opposed to a shared objective reality. Okay, we'll get more into that on a different slide on a different time. All right, that's all I have for you today, and I will see you all, I guess, on Wednesday.